Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning, by Alexander Dugin. Part 1. Sein und Sein. Chapter 1. Meeting Heidegger. An Invitation to a Journey. Martin Heidegger in the USSR. A distant shelf in a library's special collections, and the futile diligence of Vladimir Bibikhin. Heidegger's legacy in the Russian-speaking context is a profoundly peculiar phenomenon. First, in the Soviet Union, his works, his ideas, his philosophy, as well as his intellectual standpoint and his worldview, were attributed to the most dangerous and unacceptable ideological compartments, placed in the most distant and closed-off sections of libraries' special collections, and were essentially considered, quote, non-existent. Any and all interest in Heidegger was looked at as a gnoseological crime, or an absolutely futile pursuit. Even the criticism of Heidegger's ideas received little attention. Thus, Heidegger, like many other non-Marxist philosophers, was closed to late Soviet, not to mention early Soviet, philosophy. He was read, translated, and discussed, quote, underground, which affected the quality of these readings, translations, and discussions. Nevertheless, a group of Soviet philosophers, led by the late Vladimir Bibikhin, the founder of the late Soviet Heideggerian school, reclaimed the right to engage in critical readings of Heidegger. This rather small group of scholars was responsible for the majority of extant translations, many of which were made in the Soviet era and circulated in samizdat. Without doubting the sincerity on the part of these enthusiasts, we must note that their translations and the depth of grasping Heidegger proved entirely unsatisfactory. The complexity of the ideological conditions, limited access to sources, specificity of their philosophical education, limitations of philosophical knowledge, and, in general, the inadequacy of the late Soviet social space for the scope of Heidegger's thinking, were responsible for the fact that we can, without any regrets, part ways with the intellectual body of work produced by this group, so as to avoid struggling with the chimeras of a historical period so worthless that in some ways it cannot come to an end, even today. It appears that Bibikhin and his circle of like-minded thinkers were, in fact, passionately captivated by Heidegger. But there is nothing more to the translations or explanations of Heidegger apart from this passion. It is completely impossible to read them, since these texts are very expressive in terms of the conditions, effort, and suffering on the part of Bibikhin himself, as well as his translator colleagues. However, apart from certain accidental coincidences, these works say practically nothing about Heidegger, or, worse yet, present such an image that makes one's hair stand on end. If we accept these texts as an accurate translation of Heidegger, then we would have to admit rather quickly that, regrettably, Heidegger himself did not understand what he was saying and writing. In short, we are dealing with complete nonsense. Heidegger as the most Western of all Western philosophers. The second issue with Heidegger's peculiar legacy in the Russian-speaking setting is that Heidegger is a fundamental link in the chain of Western European philosophy and corresponds to the internal logic of its development. Therefore, generally, he is intelligible to the Western European philosopher, who can move freely in the taxonomy of ideas and theories of Western European culture. To understand Heidegger, one must be, in the very least, a European. After all, Heidegger himself constantly emphasizes that he thinks in Europe, of Europe, and for Europe, conceiving of it as a particular historical, philosophical, and civilizational whole. Dogmatic Marxism and the Russian intellectual milieu, rather complicated both in the last decade of the USSR and today, intersect with the main trajectory of Western European man largely in a fragmentary, episodic, and tangential way. We, Russians, conceive of ourselves as Europeans, and we resemble them in some ways, external appearance, phenotype, language, religion, socio-political system, etc., However, philosophy highlights those nuances in which it is most difficult to deceive or manipulate the state of affairs, and it is in this sphere that there is very little Western European in us all. If it exists at all, then it resembles a caricature. More likely, however, is that we are dealing with a particular kind of Russian thinking, of which we are barely cognizant ourselves, let alone of other cultures' particularities. In a way, Heidegger represents quintessential Western thought. It is more profound, central, and at the same time more Western than in the case of other European thinkers who are more accessible, bracket, although not by much. A relaxed, even-paced, and careful reading of Heidegger, along with maintaining one's own dignity, this, perhaps, is the most serious test of a Russian-European dialogue. Heidegger and the metalanguage of a new philosophy. And, finally, the third point. Heidegger consciously aims to establish a new language of philosophy, a kind of metalanguage. This is based on his specific philosophy of language, bracket, sprachphilosophie, which he formulated along with the general development of his thought. The essence of this approach consists of the following. 1. Removing the influence of Western European philosophy and metaphysics, bracket, with their logic, grammar, implicit ontology, etc., close bracket, on language and its structures. That is, rejecting the presentation of philosophical terms in the context of that metalanguage that Western European philosophy developed and sanctioned over the period of its 2,500-year history. 2. Returning to words, bracket, instead of terms, categories, and concepts, close bracket, and their original meaning outside of philosophy, their etymology, as well as their own pre-logical and pre-metaphysical content. 3. Developing a new metalanguage for a new philosophy, which will be built upon the basis of words, disseminating information about being, and having a radically different trajectory from the kind of communication that was used in previous philosophical discourse. The level of Heidegger's texts demands great effort even from a full-fledged European philosopher, bracket, in general, from a thinking European, close bracket, which is quite difficult for German-speaking readers, and even more difficult for native speakers of other European languages. The question of correctly interpreting and adequately translating Heidegger was being settled in European philosophy throughout the entire 20th century. The latter led to the creation of a kind of, quote, Heideggerian dictionary, which philosophers use in addition to a range of translations, each nuance of which presents a subject for specialized discussions. In addition to philosophers, other academics, such as philologists, historians, scholars of antiquity, and psychologists, are also involved in comprehending and translating Heidegger. After all, the difficulty of understanding Heidegger is not a technical problem, but rather a question of choosing a radical turn on the path of Western philosophy urged by Heidegger. Europeans participate in making this turn by translating, interpreting, and commenting on Heidegger. There are no fewer complexities in the translation of his texts into French or English than into Russian. Yet the best minds of Europe have struggled with this problem for almost a century, starting with those who read and attempted to understand him in the original form from the outset, bracket, Jean-Paul Sartre, for instance, owes much to early Heidegger, even including the name of his philosophy, quote, existentialism.